Hello everyone, welcome. It is Thursday yet again. Another week has passed the world by, and here we go. So let's just look, we've got all the normals are online, which is cool. I thought you'd all disappear off and do work and pub and stuff now that all that's starting to open up. So Jerry's on, YouTube Jerry's on. Alan, you do win extra points against Paula. Paula coming in and saying hi and then going doesn't count as joining the live session. But anyway, let's talk about what we're going to go through today. As normal, it's an hour's worth of Capture One editing with your images, not mine. So you guys have been kind enough to send in images over the last week or two or three. We're on a bit of a catch-up at the moment. And we're going to edit those images using Capture One, which is the raw editor. If you don't have Capture One, then go to capture1.com. You can get a free trial. It lasts for 30 days. If you do have Capture One, either you're on version 21, which is the latest version, in which case make sure you're on 21.1.1. That was released a little while ago, I think a couple of weeks ago now. That's got all of the latest fixes and bug annihilations within. If you're on version 20, you'll be able to follow along just fine for most of what we're doing today. Maybe not with anything with style brushes or dehaze, but most of the other functions will be okay. If you're on a version previous to 20, and obviously we jumped back to 12 as it were, or 11 or 10, you might want to consider upgrading because that's now getting a little bit long in the tooth. But anyway, that's down to you, your choice. So in terms of what we're going to go through today, just remember that this session is interactive. Please do put comments in as we're going. If you think I've done something wrong or you think I should do something different, by all means, put in questions, and we'll try and answer them as we go. There is about a 7 or 8 second delay. That's the way that streaming works. It's not my choice between you typing in a comment and me seeing it. So all that said, I guess that's the sort of ground rules done. The emergency exits are here and here. Let's go into Capture One. And before we actually load up the application, I want to cover this week, obviously, some news that's come out from both Apple and also Capture One. So talking about the M1 chip. And of course, with M1, a lot of people have already switched to M1. And I can tell you, it's faster. So using Capture One 21 on an M1 chip is faster, even using Rosetta, which is the translation tool, than it is running on an Intel chip, for sure. But of course, this week, Apple launched the new campaign for M1-enabled iPad Pros. So I can tell you now, today, in this session, I'm going to give you a first look at Capture One 21 running on an M1 chip on an iPad Pro. There you go. That's Capture One 21 running on my M1 MacBook Pro from an iPad Pro, or on an iPad Pro. You're welcome. But that all that said, sorry, I just want to cover this because we're seeing more and more people requesting, when is it coming to the iPad? When is it coming to M1 native and so on? Capture One have said quite openly that the M1 version of the software, the native version of M1 software, is going to come in May. The exact date to be decided or to be determined. But those people that are on M1 chips, you will be able to use it natively in May. Of course, there's testing going on at the moment. There's all sorts of benchmarks that people are trying to hit. But until it's ready, they're not going to release it. It's that simple. When it is ready, they will. In terms of running on an M1 iPad Pro, the issue isn't the chip. The issue is the operating system. So until Capture One at some point, maybe, who knows, runs on an iOS platform, effectively, as long as that iPad is running iOS, which is a derivative of macOS, we know, but unfortunately things aren't quite the same between macOS and iPadOS as it is. So even though it's got the M1 chip, it's not immediately going to be able to run on an iPad Pro. And you've also got all the interface stuff to think about. How do you deal with touch and swipe and healing brushes and option keys and all the other stuff? So just be careful. The key thing for me is the guys at Capture One are focused on getting the software shored up, stable, fast, reliable. Things like Metal that have maybe been long in the tooth now or quite a way waiting. Hopefully, as the M1 development starts to hit, we'll see some of those improvements come in. And to me, that's more important than the early adoption of some of the new toys. So let's go into Capture One. Not this Capture One, but this Capture One. So normal Capture One, I'm running Mac OS. For those of you that are running Windows, the difference is when I'm talking basically will be pretty much whenever I say Option key, you're going to use the Alt key on your keyboard. Before we start the actual edit of this shot, so this is from Claudiu. It's Canary Wharf, I think. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, we said we'd pick up on this from last week. A couple of interface things, because I've had a couple of questions in. And in fact, one of them came in this morning on Facebook from Henry. And it was about where do we set the exposure levels or the warning levels in Capture One. So you have an exposure warning whenever something is going to hit 255 or more, or in fact the default is I think 250. You're going to get this warning come up, so you can see it on your picture. Mine is set in pink. Part of the reason for that is if I had drawn a mask, so let's create a new layer. Let's just create a slightly smaller brush so we can actually see it. So as I start drawing a mask in red, I don't want to get that confused with an exposure warning, so I have that chosen in magenta, but that's my personal choice. Where do we set those? Well, it's in preferences. So in Capture One, you go to your preferences, and you'll see under, you've got general, obviously. This is where, by the way, if ever anyone says to you to turn off your hardware acceleration because you're having problems, this is where it is. This is where you set it to never and never, and hopefully it temporarily fixes the problem. But it's the exposure tab here where your exposure warning is stored. And the question that Henry had is, where do you have it set to? So I don't have the official answer as to what's best. What I can tell you is what I do, which is I have it set to 254. Simple reason. I only really want to know when it's actually clipped. Now remember, the exposure warning is going to come on whenever either the red, the green, or the blue channels are clipped at 255. Doesn't mean that it's completely overexposed. For example, if I take a shot of a red street light or a traffic light, it will be flagged as overexposed because the red channel will be fully saturated. It'll be 255. That's not a problem. It's just flagging to me that one of the channels is overexposed or hitting that clipping level. So be careful how you interpret these numbers. To me, having it set at 250 doesn't really help me because I know there's still data there. So there's still data at 251, there's still data at 252, 253. It's only 254 and 255 where it gets a bit hairy. At 255 and beyond, we have no more data there. If I print it, there's nothing in that cell for that channel. If they're all 255, of course, then there's no data at all. It's all completely white. So I have mine set at 254. The reason being because I want to know when it's really a problem, not when it's sort of a problem. Next one, actually, let's just go back into it. The shadow warning. A lot of people have this turned on and it can result in a pretty scary picture. So let me just go into here. Let's just set this at 250 and I don't know, 6. In my picture here, I'll now have these little blue dots somewhere. Oh, actually, no. Claudiu, you did good. There's not much in the shadows that's lost. For the purposes of demonstration, though, let's just pull down the exposure. So I've got blue areas here which are underexposed, shadow warning. And I've got pink areas here which are overexposed, so highlight warning. If I turn the exposure warning off, they disappear. But the shadow one is less important to me than the highlight one. And the reason is that the highlight one tells me at 255, there is no data that I can pull back. Of course, we've got access to a wider dynamic range, but in broad terms, it's more dangerous having something clip at 255 than it is having it in the shadows, because in the shadows, I can often pull it up. It may mean if I pull it up too much, sorry, Claudio, I'm using your image as an example, but if I pull it up too much, I might bring up too much noise as well. But that's my choice. There's still data there in the shadows. So to me, having a shadow warning doesn't really help me. I can see if something's underexposed, and I can use my mouse here to tell me what the values are up the top, and I can see the histogram. To a certain extent, the highlight warning isn't too helpful on a shot like this. So for example, let's just turn it off. Where are the areas that are going to be overexposed? Well, they're going to be the light that I'm shining directly into. So if this is overexposed, well, having the software paint it in pink doesn't really help me. And in fact, I would argue that this down here is lost all detail. It's flagged as not overexposed, but it's not much use to me. Here, it's saying it's completely overexposed, and here as well. But I know that from there. So personally, I would rely more on your histogram, more on your sense of what's good enough to bring up from shadows without noise, and more on your, I guess, sort of artistic view on what are you trying to have the computer or the image display. For example, if I'm shooting into streetlights or traffic trails, of course they're going to be overexposed. They're bright lights pointing directly into the camera. So always interpret these things in the best way for you. So that was Henry's thing. As I say, personally, I have mine set to 254 up here, and I have my shadow warning off. How you choose to do it, up to you, but that's how I have it set. Second one, someone got a bit trapped with this, which was they tried to change view or zooming in, but I can't fill the whole screen. Simple reason, there's a proof margin enabled. So if I press this little button here, I can turn that off. You'll also see that you can do it through the preference, or you can change the width, of the proof margin through preferences. So if I go into our appearance here, we've got a margin here, which is global. So that margin applies all the time in here. So typically that's set to around 5. And then you have a proof margin, which doesn't show unless you have proof margin enabled. When you do have it enabled, it will take on the color of your global margin. So if I set this to dark, you'll see it's gone more gray. The reason the proof margin is useful, if I want to see how this image looks against white paper, it can be really handy because I don't understand necessarily how dark an image is when I'm looking at it against black. So some people choose to edit against white. I don't. It's too harsh for my eyes. Some people have it medium. That's one option that I quite often use. Some dark, but for making something look vivid, we use black. If you don't get your picture filling the whole browser, either the picture is way too small, because if that's at 100%, there's a problem, or you have your proof margin enabled. So turn it off up there. So let's edit Claudiu's picture. Now Claudiu's online, so we can have a bit of a play with it. And the question for Claudiu was, how do we deal with things that have got a very, very slight slither of highlights, so things like these, where the rest of the image is actually quite muted, which, as you can see in this shot, it is. And actually, before we even go into there, I'm going to show you something in editing which is actually quite important here, which is around the lens correction. You'll see a lot of people talk about diffraction, and they'll talk about diffraction being something or diffraction correction, sorry, being something that you add around f8, f11, something like that. And the reason is because at smaller apertures, your image is more likely or more prone to see diffraction within it. And diffraction manifests itself as a softening of edges. You lose some sharpness, you lose some detail on the edges. So this shot, as we can see at the bottom left, as always, it will tell us the information. By the way, again, fun one. If you don't see this information, go to View, under Customize Viewer, Labels. I've seen someone struggle with this before. If I turn that off, I don't see this information. So if the information's missing, View, Customize Viewer, Labels. There it is. That's also where you'll see your proof margin if you don't see your little icon up there for whatever reason. So diffraction correction will fix up some sharpness issues, but also at night time, it has the effect of clarifying lights. And in this case here, I'm being very unfair, we're at 200%, but actually the image isn't quite sharp. It's not exactly pin sharp. Diffraction correction, even on 5.6, will actually help this to sharpen up a little bit. And it's a very subtle change. Hopefully you can sort of see it, but on streaming you might not be able to. But it's just outlining this a little bit sharper and cleaning up some of these edges. So we often talk about this. Use the tools that you need to use to make sure the image is getting better. Don't just tick them for the sake of it. There's no point in doing that. You're risking the image quality. But if the tool improves the image, like in this case it does, then enable it and move on from there. Right. So there is our wider view, and to be honest, I've shot similar shots to this where I've been a little bit frustrated with the fact that there's nothing going on in the sky and down here. first thing I'm going to do on this, and Claudiu might not like this, but sorry, we're going to crop it down. And at minimum, I'm going to crop it down to 2x3. I could arguably crop it down to 1x2, which is going to be a bit more dramatic. It's going to make it less usable, and what I mean by that is if we want to add margin onto the top, there's less headroom. If we want to add text over there, if you want to use it for different purposes, it becomes very niche. So 2x3 is a safer one to edit with, and worst case scenario, you can always crop it down if you need to. So I'm going to stick with 2x3. Here's the rule, isn't it? You know, let's put everything on the 1/3 line. Nah, when it comes to reflection, I have no problem whatsoever in using the global middle line. Yes, of course, we have rules that say that something looks aesthetically nicer when it's on a spiral or on a 2/3 point or whatever. But things like this, where they're all about the symmetry, I don't have even a second thought about putting it in the middle. If we were to put it on a 1/3 line, either up the top or down below, great for text down here or something like that if it's needed for editorial purposes, but absolutely no need to. There's no reason to do it, and there's no need to not put it on that center line. Claudius just said go wild. I usually crop it to 16:9. Yeah, so 16:9. You know, it's obviously our screen version, effectively of 2x3 or even 2x1, depending on where you're coming from. But 16:9, if you're displaying it digitally, will give you that same sort of feel. For me, it's just tradition says 2x3 is a reasonable print for a landscape too. And you just clarified, thank you. So sharpness might be from the high res mode of my camera. 8 shots overlaid in the camera. It possibly is. Obviously, there wasn't much wind going on when this was going on, given the water, but there's just a bit of a shift in there. It's almost like I tried to work out whether it was slightly back focused or something, but it's not. It's almost like there is a bit of in-camera movement or something that's not quite got it right. But we'll have a look in a minute. We'll see what we can do. Okay, so I'm going to actually reset all of our settings on here and set us back to how it was shot. And you'll see the change. It was a subtle change that I did, but let's just go back to here. So this is out of camera. And with that out of camera, you can see immediately there's a little bit more softening even on it. But you can see that change up here. We've lost some of this detail in here because I'll come back to the clarity thing in a minute. But it just looks a lot softer out of camera, a little less metal. And certainly for something like Canary Wharf, you kind of want it to feel a bit more, I don't know, steel and glass and urban and so on. So that's what we're going to try and add in. First thing then, let's actually soften off the top of this image. Again, a small amount. Everything we're going to do is tiny. So I'm going to hold down, I'm going to choose a gradient filter or gradient mask. That gradient mask, because I don't have another layer enabled, when I click, it's going to create a new adjustment layer. I'm going to hold down the Shift key on my keyboard. If I don't, I've got free reign as to where that gradient goes. If I hold down the Shift key, it clicks it at 45-degree increments. So I'm going to pull it down there so it's soft. The softness of your gradient is determined by the distance between this bar here and this bar here. This is the fall off. And then I'm going to shunt it back up there. And press M on my keyboard to make the mask go away, the mask being the red thing. And we're going to call this one Sky Top. And with that, I'm just going to pull down the exposure a little bit. The reason, I want to get the impression that the city is glowing. And with a flat sky that keeps on going at the same rate at the top, we kind of lose that a little bit. Next up, you can probably guess this one. Water bottom. If I just clicked another gradient and started drawing while selecting the sky top layer, it's going to overwrite the gradient that I had on the sky top layer. So from the first one I do, the first time I ever create a new gradient or a radial gradient, it's going to create a new layer for me. From then on, it's going to do it on the current layer or the upmost layer. So just be careful if you want to do a second gradient on a different area, create your new layer first. Otherwise, it's going to overwrite the one that you're already on. So click, hold down the Shift key, make it nice and straight, and we're going to come up to there. And again, very subtle, just drop that exposure down. So with those two in there, all we've done is we've gone from a flat image here to one that's more focused into the city. Another thing to remember when you're dealing with reflections, the light level from the reflection will not match the light level directly from those lights. It's always going to be a bit darker, a little bit more subdued. So you can afford to go a bit heavier on the water when it comes to reflections than you can in the sky. Right, next up then, let's go back to our background layer, and I'm going to make some global changes. And for those changes, I'm not really worried about down here. This is all really clear. It looks like Claudiu has cleaned his sensor and his lens very recently, from what I can see. I can't see anything going on there. We've got, whether that's a hot pixel or a plane, not sure. We might want to heal that out. Normally for a hot pixel or something like that, we'd go into our details tab, and under our, under noise reduction, we got a single pixel, and as I push that up, eventually that hot pixel would disappear if it's small enough, if it's 1 pixel. This is obviously not, it's a big lump. So as a result, we're going to ignore that one. There's no need to use it. So again, if you don't need to use a tool, don't use it. Instead, go to our healing brush. I can just click on it and Capture One's going to guess where to heal from. It did a good job, so that's fine. If I want to tell Capture One where to heal from, I can either now pick up that origin and move it, or I can hold down the Option key or Alt on Windows, click a source, let go of the Option or Alt key, and click a destination. I can manually do that. So to delete, click on it until it goes orange, press the delete key. Done. So back to our global changes. Not too worried about down here, not worried about there. We've removed that little annoying thing in the top. We'll call that one Heal Red Light. And now I'm going to focus on the city itself. So let's go into there. And first thing, I'm on the background layer because I'm going to make some global adjustments. I could do this on an adjustment layer over the top, but it doesn't really make much difference in this case. I want this city to pop. If I push this too much, the city will pop, but I'm going to start seeing a few little halos and artifacts around the edges. So this is where the edge gets darker outside of the dark area on the transition point between two spots on the shot. In this shot, it's not done a bad job with a lot of clarity, but it's too much. You can see that's just too much. Let me temporarily undo clarity. So that's before. That's after. You can see these halos appearing here on the right and on the left. So even though when you're zoomed in you don't notice them, when you're zoomed out you can see, look at that and look at that. It's just too much. So be really careful with clarity. The temptation on a city is to slide clarity all the way up because you get all of this decent stuff and sharpness and texture and whatever. But no one then steps back to look at what you've done. And this here is a telltale sign there's just too much local contrast. So back down with the clarity. Probably no more than 30. That's it. Now, structure. Because I said we'd talk about this a second ago. Because the image is slightly soft, only slightly, it's not a big deal. I'd like to use structure to fix some of that. Now, again, too much structure. Let's not do that. And it looks horrible when we zoom out. But structure can be helpful when it comes to just getting some of those details back nice and sharp. So it's looking for texture and edges. It's looking to enhance those and make them look a bit clearer. So that's all well and good, but it's also going to do it out here. Now this image luckily is actually pretty clean, but in fact that was something in the sky, wasn't it? Because we've got our reflection of it there. Little handy hint, by the way. If ever you're going to heal something from the sky, make sure you've healed its counterpart from the reflection below. Otherwise, it's a bit of a giveaway that you've deleted it. Okay, so structure we want to use, but we don't want to use that much of it on other areas because it can bring up noise and it can make things like these branches and the trees look a little artificial and so on. So instead of doing it on the background layer, where clarity I'm fine with, structure we're going to do locally. So we're going to create a new layer and we're going to call it structure local. And with a brush, really easy. I'm not going to go particular, so 100% flow, 100% opacity. I want it quite binary. I'm not going to go particularly careful on this because I just want to get hints of it, and we're not going to load up so much structure that you're going to see horrible edges. So if I was doing this to 100% structure, then we'd probably be using auto mask, maybe even a luma range around it, and deleting the stuff around the buildings that we don't want to be enhanced with detail. But because I'm only going to use it subtly, we can get away with a really rough mask. And a lot of you will have seen me use really rough masks in Capture One. And it's because we're not doing big swings. We're not doing massive color shifts. We're not doing huge clarity changes. If I'm not doing any of that stuff, you don't really notice the boundary of where these things start and stop. So could have probably filled that mask, but we're pretty much done now. Okay, so I've now got my city roughly with that mask, knowing that I'm not going to affect anything else on the image. I can now go to structure and I can pull it up. Now I could go that high, it's probably too much still, but we can yeah, we can get away with sort of 30, maybe even 35. Okay, so let's just have a little review. We've got our structure on the buildings to sharpen them up a little bit. We've fixed this red light floating thing in the sky. We've darkened the foreground, the water, and we've darkened the top slightly, so we've got some fall off of the frame away from the city. On the background, we've added some clarity. Now it's time to play with HDR. So not only now are we going to pull up a couple of shadows, and remember, every time I pull these up, I might want to reconsider how much exposure in general I've pulled down on the sky. So I'm going to pull that down a little bit more as well. So of course I'm lifting the shadows. Most of this shot sits in the shadows. We can see that from the histogram. So be careful, it's a bit of a seesaw. As you pull one up, you might want to pull one down to counter it. Williams just asked, sorry William, just missed that. Can you use a clarity style brush? Absolutely, yes you can. The issue for me is, in this case, I just want a blanket coverall. So effectively, if I go into, where are we? Is there actually one? That's a good point. We could create a clarity style brush, but actually a clarity style brush is literally just going to be clarity at a certain point. So I'm not too sure you're gaining much by having a single tool style brush, unless you were saving the brush settings in there. But either way, you're going to draw a mask and you're going to add clarity to that local area if you wanted to do that. In this case, it's fine going relatively global. Just for reference, if we didn't want it global, if we just wanted it over the city, we'd do exactly the same as what we did with that structure mask. In fact, we can do it now. Let's just do it in structure. So the one that we drew very roughly over the city, and undo it in the background. This is another thing to keep in mind though. Don't forget that you're doubling up if you forget to undo it before. So if you pull up, let's say, or pull up the shadows in the background, then you create a new layer and say pull up the shadows again, you're doubling it up. It's not, one doesn't override the other, they're cumulative. So just be careful that you don't overdo it. So overall in the shot, we've pulled up the shadows a little bit. I might want to pull up black a touch. Be careful pulling up the black slider. If you pull this up too much, you're going to flatten the image. The whole image is just going to go sketchy, my favorite one at the moment, cartoony, or whatever you want to call it, but we lose contrast. So you can pull it up by all means, just to take the edge off some of those shadows, but don't pull it up too much or you're going to lose all that contrast, and it's contrast we're trying to add in. Highlights and whites. So let's look at our histogram and what's it telling us. The bulk of the data in this shot is in the midtones, slightly upper midtones, and then all in the shadows. This tiny little bump up here is all of this lighting along here in the city. And in order to see that more clearly, I'm going to pull highlights and whites all the way down. So if I just temporarily undo that, that's before, that's after. Where these are quite overexposed, it's a very subtle difference, but now at least you can start to see more of the letters out of HSBC. Do not worry about pulling down your highlights and whites all the way to the bottom on a histogram that has hardly any of them. What this is telling you is the bits that are overexposed, they're in the highlights, they're in the whites. That's what you're pulling down. Everything else is not going to be even the slightest bit affected by that change. So highlights all the way down, whites all the way down. Typically on a city, that's what we'll do. It just brings some of the detail back from those flary points and overexposed edges. Finally, let's look at our white balance. So we could go warmer, which actually I kind of like, but let's just go the other way to begin with. Typically in a city at night, you'd go a bit cooler and add in a bit of non-green tint. But in this case, I don't think it's the right tone. The cities, in general, cities tend to look quite cool when they're, when they're blue, when they're in the blue area of the spectrum. But in this case here, because that sky is so blue, there's something quite nice about actually warming up the overall tone of the shot. Now, I don't want a purple sky, of course. So we've got to be careful with our tint here. We don't want it green or yellow, but we don't want it up to this end either. So we want to sort of back away the second the sky starts changing colour. But look at what we've got now. It's a much more vibrant city. So we go from there to there, but we've lost a bit of the blue in the sky. So how can we deal with that? Well, we've got a colour editor to do that. So we're going to create a new filled layer. Filled layer means when I press M on the keyboard, the mask is all the way across the image. So everything I do is going to apply to everything. I could go to advanced color editor and choose the sky color, or I can go onto basic and choose blue. But in this case, let's go on to this one, choose the sky, and we're going to stretch that out a little bit to include all of the blue tones from fully saturated to desaturated, from cyan all the way around to almost purple, not quite purple. And we're going to pull up the saturation. Again, not too much. Don't do that. Danger. Let's pull it up, I don't know, 23 or so. That works. And of course, we can control the lightness of it. Ooh, interesting. We're not going to play at that level on this one, but it's an interesting look, even if it's a bit weird. But we can control how bright the sky and the water is. So I'm going to come down to probably, I don't know, -5, something like that. That sort of works. And that to me feels just a bit more finished as a cityscape. Right, Alan said, I find the red lights in the trees and the right distracting. Would you clone them out? I noticed that. I think it's either a top of a building or something like that. Yeah, I think it is. It's a tough one, isn't it? They are a bit distracting. We do have a reflection of it here. They are permanent. I'm not massively keen to clone them out, but if we want to, I'm going to choose a source and clone that one. And of course, remember, if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that we've certainly reduced that same element down in the reflection. This is going to be a personal choice one, because I think we've got to be careful that we're not completely obliterating what actually is there, and what is there are the two bright red lights. But I agree, Alan, they are a little distracting. That's Claudiu's choice to make. But overall, that's what we would do with a bit of a slither of light, as we call it. So if I do before and after, which is this button up here, or Y on your keyboard, that's where we come from. That's where we get to. To me, that just feels a bit more vibrant than the original. That said, the original's a nice shot. We're editing to try and enhance it. We're not editing to change it, because there's nothing wrong with that first shot. When I go in at 100%, however, you'll see here the difference is actually quite stark. Certainly in terms of, if we look at the detail in these buildings, we go from there to here. That sort of makes a big difference. And again, on these signs at the top, remember, we've done diffraction correction, we've done some clarity, we've pulled down highlights, we've pulled down whites, and all of that adds up to being clearer in this signage, and that's really important on a city shot. Signs are going to overexpose. You can't avoid that, but try and get as much detail back as you can. Brian, perhaps capture one and install a siren noise that sounds when I'm about to do something stupid. here's the beauty with it. Everything that we've just done, because we've done it mostly on layers, if we decide that the water at the bottom is too dark, well, A, I can just turn that layer off. B, I can back away the amount of the effect here. Or C, I can change the opacity. And I think I talked about this last week. Just when you're editing, every now and then, just keep going back to the original. And one thing that is really handy, if you create a clone or a version of your original on the right, it means that you've got your edited version and your original down here at all times to just keep a glancing eye at, that you haven't taken this and changed it into something that it never was. That's really useful. So I tend to edit now with a copy of the original with no adjustments made, just in that thumbnail browser, just to help. Where are we, Jed? Could you not select them and just decrease the lightness? If you're talking about the lights, no, but good question. Good point. So here's the problem. Very good point. This is why we can't do that. So I'm being unfair. We're zoomed in at 400%. Highlight recovery drags extra dynamic range data. Let me just clone this. Extra dynamic range data where it can out of the histogram, and it pulls it back into our visible view. So if I turn our, where are we, background, let's just turn our high dynamic range off. So we're back now to without shadows and highlights recovered. So instead, let's do it with a heal, or with a brush layer, sorry, heal layer. Create, I'm going to call this layer Jed, so we don't get confused. So 100% opacity, 100% flow, and I'm going to paint over this sign and paint over this sign. And actually, we're going to go even more fancy. We're going to have a luma range. I'm going to hope it doesn't affect the system when we're doing it. So that luma range is only affecting the very brightest parts of that sign, and then it falls off quite nicely. There, good, okay. So we've got a luma range on a mask that's going to apply against that light. He says. And I think the regulars are going to know what's coming next. We're not going to blame Jed. We're going to blame David. Oh, no, we're good. We're good. It's okay. Calm down. But we're still not going to blame Jed. We're still going to blame David. So we've now got our mask with a luma range applied over that sign. Press M on the keyboard. Mask is going to go away. Now, with that done, and to Jed's point, can we not just reduce the brightness of it? So let's just pull down the exposure. So let's go maybe 2 stops down. So this has gone from, if I put my mouse there, a white color to a gray color. Now why? Because originally it was up here, so move my mouse over to here. I've got a couple of things going on at the moment for some reason. I'm a bit concerned that it's taking so long. As I move my mouse over, look at the top of the screen underneath where it says cursor tools. And it's going to tell me, is it 255 red, 255 green, 252 blue? It's pretty much overexposed. Let's pull down that exposure again to 2 stops under. It's still overexposed. There's no new data being pulled in. It's not capturing extra bits of dynamic range and trying to settle it within the visible bit. It's just dragging those values down. So the temptation in this is to try and pull the exposure down a lot to try and rescue those highlights. All that's going to happen is something that was already blown and white is now just going to become grey and darker grey and darker grey. As I pull that exposure down, there's no more data to grab. And this, I guess, is the point that if we go back to our one with the HDR version, this is 100% highlights and whites pulled back, and it's still not clear. And the reason is there is no more data. So drawing a new layer over the top and saying, right, pull the exposure down, you're going to make the bright white parts darker, but they're just going to be just as flat as they were when they were white. They're just going to now be flat grey. So it doesn't really get us any further, unfortunately. But there we go. So it's a nice shot, Claudiu. Make sure you print it. But we go from our original there to a relatively subtle change, but the change is big enough in my eyes to make that pop, and we've got some sharpness back, and we're in a pretty good place when it comes to the highlight recovery and so on. Let's have a look next at Krisjan's shots. This is an Iceland shot, and the question was, if I remember rightly, about whether there's too much color in it. Is it the right edit? How are we looking, basically? So first things first, let's go back to the original, which is there. And we can see in here, so already we've got the right lens profile loaded in. I've already checked this before. Diffraction correction doesn't help us on this. It does need some distortion fixing, which is why that's dialed in. So our lens corrections are done. Let's just have a look at our overall image and look at Krisjan's changes. And they're quite extensive. There's quite a lot of pulling up HDR ranges, a lot of clarity loaded in, a lot of structure, big level change to really make the image pop. So, of course, as you pull in bright levels and dark levels, you're stretching the histogram, you're making more contrast. And that's how it ends up. But I sort of get to a place where, don't get me wrong, Iceland is a very green country, randomly. I should have called Iceland Greenland and Greenland Iceland, but there we go. So the greens in here are really nice and rich, and it's great. But this blue out the back just doesn't feel right. It's not, Iceland isn't blue like that, and certainly the sky up here, that doesn't quite ring true to me of how that sky would look. It would be more grey. So the issue is that, of course, we've got on here, I'll just load up these adjustment layers, we've got a layer that covers the sky, and that's pulling down all the highlights, pulling down all of the shadows and so on, with another layer that covers the foreground here, and that's actually brightening highlights. So when we look at the was it Land Rover? I'm guessing. That roof is being lifted by this highlight piece here, so it's really, really pumping some of the values in this shot to add in huge amounts of contrast. So normally where we'd use highlight recovery, this one's actually pushing it further away. I'm in a place where I don't actually have a problem with what's been done with the sky as such, but it does feel a little overdone. It does feel like it's adding in colours that may not quite suit. The crop, I don't have an issue with, the slightest problem with that. I think this is a nice crop. It gets rid of this. I would potentially just go to an unconstrained crop for a second. Just squeeze a little more out of that foreground. I know we didn't talk about, or we talked about not using thirds and all that sort of stuff. I would be tempted just to get as much as we can out of there to give us a bit more space before we launch into the road. But it's this bit back here that I think we've got to be careful with, because that sky filter, it's just too much. It's a big exposure pull. It's a big contrast increase. The saturation is up. Now remember, this saturation slider isn't a true saturation slider. It's more like vibrance. It's doing a couple of other things. But, we're pushing it quite a bit as a result, and it's turning blue and it's going funny. So I'm going to undo the saturation. I'm going to undo the contrast. I'm also going to undo the highlight and undo the shadow. And I might even undo the clarity. And in fact, I'm going to undo the exposure. So I've pretty much undone that layer. All I've left is the actual mask itself. And then thinking about it, you can now see my brain process working. I'm just going to undo all of that by deleting the layer. And instead, I'm going to use a style brush. I'm going to use my favorite style brush, Deep Sky. This is going to be too much if we do this out of the box, because the Deep Sky brush is designed with quite a hard edge, no flow, no opacity, no nothing. So I'm going to soften that hardness down because I need to blend this with the foreground, and I'm going to shrink it a little bit too. So with that done, and remember, I can, of course, back away what we do, but I can now paint this in with a soft edge that stops short of this foreground. Now, to me, that's a much nicer, cleaner edit than where we were here. And ironically, it's actually got more contrast in. It's not so colourful for sure, and we might want to do a bit more of recovery back again. But let's just see what we can do in terms of trying to do it without resorting to these big shifts here. So first off, let's actually use a bit more highlight recovery. So the deep sky brush already does some highlight recovery. I have just noticed there's probably a little bit too much going on that foreground bit. So let's just do a really soft brush here. Let's pull down the opacity. I'm just going to erase back some of this foreground. Again, I want to feather it. I don't want it to have a really hard fall off where it's just binary and stops. So that's probably a bit better there. Yep, pretty good. So now we've got our contrast in the background. Great, it's got a lot of presence. It comes with highlight recovery. We're going to pull that down just a touch more. But remember, as you pull down highlights and pull up shadows, we're cutting contrast, and that's a real issue. So just, again, be careful with that. With here, oh, sorry, I just noticed, where are we? Brian's just said, the white rocks at the bottom margin seem to distract me. I'd include or remove them completely. Yeah, to be honest, I saw it. It's a tough one because of this angle here. And it's where we've got a rotation to try and make this road. If we look at the original, the road is obviously off at an angle. This is done through rotation. I'm just wondering what would happen if we do a little change through our keystone tool instead. So with our keystone, I can pull there and leave that where it is and hit apply. That's going to straighten up our road. That gives me a bit more margin down here. So with that margin, I can now be a bit clever and pull in either, as Brian says, more of it or less of it with the road. I'm tempted to go more. Again, this is personal choice. If you would do something different, then go for it. But using the keystone tool rather than the rotate tool, we can flatten that line out a bit more. Rather than just shifting the whole image, we can just shift the right-hand side of it a little bit better. So, Brian, from your point of view, if you'd rather crop them out, I think the problem with cropping them out is you get very close to this gravel area here and you lose this nice band, I guess, that sort of separates out in layers. So with our dramatic sky, as it were, or deep sky, we've got a lot of clarity in there. Be careful with noise with the deep sky brush and other ones that do clarity. We have got a bit of a dust spot, so I'm just going to go to our healing brush. Because we don't have a healing layer already in the system, then the second I choose an origin, or let Capture One do it, and start drawing, it's going to create a heal layer for me. And it's going to get it a bit wrong because I've chosen an area that goes from dark to light instead of going dark to middle. So we're going to change the origin and say, actually, let's take it from there. And that does a much better job. So careful with overdoing clarity, careful with noise, careful with dust spots when we bring up contrast. But then this background layer, again, I'm tempted again just to use a couple of other tools. So with our deep sky layer, which happens to be our sky and background, I'm going to push a bit more contrast. But I'm going to go to my levels and I'm going to pull down the dark levels in that background. So you see what that's doing. Let's just temporarily undo. So hold down the Option key. That's undone. And that's redone. So what I'm doing on this layer alone, just this area, I'm pulling down the stuff that's in the lower midtones and making it forced to live in the shadows. So anything that was 21 is now 0. That's a bit too much. So I'm just going to back it off to maybe 12. That's pretty good. We've now got a lot more presence in the background without, most importantly, that sort of bluey color up here. And to me, that's sort of where I'd be tempted to leave it, because anything we do now, we're changing the rugged feel of this, really. Let's just clone it and do a couple of other tweaks so you can make your own decisions. But let's say we want to do what we did before, which is just have a... Oops, sorry. I warned you of doing that earlier, and then I did it myself. So grabbing a gradient layer, unfortunately, then undoes what we've already done on that layer. So new layer, we'll call it sky, new gradient on that layer. So with this gradient, if I pull down the exposure a little bit, do we get it better? Maybe. But then it does seem weird that we're darker in the background and lighter in the foreground. Those layers stop making sense. So, I'm in the place where this is where I'd stop, genuinely. I would just stop at this point. I've lost, actually, funnily enough, my my healing layer, which is a bit annoying. Let's just create a new one. There. But, you know, pushing it too far, I don't think is going to help us in this one. Using the keystone tool to pull that round sort of helps a little bit. Sorry, that's where I missed it. It was on this one. Using the keystone tool to pull it round a little bit really helps level up that road, gets you some more foreground if you want it. If you don't, then we're just going to delete those white parts anyway. But this one genuinely, you know, if we push it too far, we get to there. And the irony is, I think where Krisjan was going was trying to get more contrast. So pushing the whites brighter, pushing the highlights brighter, pulling down the shadows and the blacks, using those levels tools really well, actually, to pull out the histogram. So adding contrast. But with all of those extra layers and all those extra changes, we actually end up with a very flat image. Whereas here, you know, in fact, to a certain extent, maybe this is overdone. So if it is deep sky, that layer, remember, on the top, I can pull back our opacity a little bit. But that looks pretty neat where it is. The background layer, if I really want to go sort of retro, we can pull a bit of vignette in just to really highlight on it. But that's where I'd get to. So there's our original on the left. Pretty hazy. There's our detailed version on the right. And I just think that this feels more, I guess, road trippy than the previous one. Peter's just asking, time for rehaze. Probably not, to be honest. We could, I mean, let's just create a new empty layer up here. Just going to draw a very rough mask. If we wanted to add in more haze, to Peter's point, let's just go on to our dehaze tool and let's pull it down and choose a new tone to add some haze. You know, yeah, of course we can add some haze, but why? Doesn't make sense in my head. This one looks cool. I like this. It's a nice picture. And it's a big skill to just be able to go, that's enough. And I struggle with it sometimes. There's always something more to tweak. Sometimes just step away. That's a nice picture. We'll leave it there. Right. So yeah, you know, genuinely on these ones, just try and work out what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve more contrast, it doesn't make sense that things are flattened. It makes sense that you're adding contrast in instead. Let's go on to Andrew's shot up here. So this was Snowdonia, I think. Right. Let's have a look. So I'm not going to change too much from what Andrew's done. He's used a lot of the style brushes. So here is our original. It's always good to go back to what was there and what's there now. I would say the foreground is probably a little heavy. There's a lot of stuff. You've actually got a style loaded in over this, which has given it that really dark, quite negative feel in terms of some of the shadows. And of course, we've got a bit of brightness fixing down in the corner, got a bit of darkening, and then there's a background in literal terms layer at the back, and all that's doing is just pulling down some of this detail. But here's the thing, the top is still unbalanced. It's a really bright top and a really dark river at the bottom, or estuary, or whatever it's called. So instead, let's just test something. I'm going to create a new filled layer. So everything is filled, as always, red. With that layer, I'm going to pull down my exposure and see what was in the sky. And actually, there's quite a bit. So, you know, at 2 stops under, we've got all this detail. We've got some dust spots, you'll be pleased to know. But it's not blown out. We've got a lot of detail in there. So why don't we use that detail? And let's create a new layer. We'll call it Sky Detail. And I'm going to create a new gradient. Again, starting from the top, I can hold down the Shift key, keep it nice and level. So there's my gradient. And with that gradient, I'm going to pull down the exposure. Not just, so if I do it with highlights and with whites, it's only going to affect the top part of my histogram. Some of this stuff isn't in the top part of the histogram, it's in the midtones. So doing it through highlight and whites will help you with the brightest parts of the image, but it's exposure or brightness that's going to really help you pull this down. And then as I pull this down there, we can get to here. And now we've got our nice coloured sky that was actually there. So that was what was there in the sky. But it doesn't quite make sense, does it? We've got this very cool blue down here and this warm mountain in the background here. So we've got kind of two choices. We can cool down the background or we can warm up the foreground. Let's try cooling down the background a little bit. Pulling up some tint. That sort of works. And then I'm going to make a final little alteration to the foreground just to try and even these two up. So again, it's all about just making sure that we don't get in a place where our foreground and our background don't match. Our eyes can see that there's something going wrong here. If it sees warm light and then a cool reflection, it doesn't quite make sense. So we go from sort of, oops, sorry, here, which is a slightly different crop in fairness, but to here with a couple of small changes. So again, it's a big change from the original. But that one layer alone, that sky detail layer, look at all this extra stuff that it's bringing back. And actually, with all that detail, we can actually use a bit of clarity as well to really make this pop. We could push a bit of structure to get some of the detail on these trees coming back. We could push some contrast just through that one layer in the sky. And that's what, I think to me, oh, sorry, playing on the wrong, playing on the wrong layer. Let's go back to our sky detail. So, let's push up some clarity, bit of structure, bit more contrast. We've got all that data. It's all sat there. We just need to use it and to access it. But whenever you do this, just really make sure that you're not changing the source of light too far from the result of that light. It does make sense that this is cooler and darker down here in the shadows. Certainly if you were down here, then the light would be cooler. Because the sun's already disappeared, but just don't get them too far apart from each other. It just starts to look a little bit wrong. And then on our, where are we? On our foreground. Let's just go back to our foreground. I just want to lift these shadows a touch. In fact, with that foreground, we're going to change our position of that gradient to cover more of this. So remember, on a gradient layer, this line tells me where I start, tells me 100% applied. By the midpoint, 50% applied. By the end, 0% applied. And as I move them in, it gets a tighter or a softer transition. And I'm just going to just warm this up a touch again there. And alter that tint a little. And by pulling up those shadows, we just end up with a slightly more balanced image, to my eyes anyway. But certainly we go from sort of here where we've lost all of our sky. And it does feel really harsh, this stuff down here, to here where it just feels maybe a little more complete as an overall picture from one element to the other. So again, before and after, let's just double check. Yep, pretty happy with that. It is a strong edit. It's a pretty clarifying edit, let's call it that. So again, if we don't like the amounts, you've got these opacity sliders on every single layer because you've done it on layers. Really easy to back them out and also add them in again if you want to. But to me, on this one, Andrew, that's sort of the edit that I'd get to there. Nothing more than that, and certainly keeping the sky down here away from that 255 area is good. I'm just going to do one thing because it's bugging me, which is to fix that little dot there. Okay. So there we go. That's it for today. You've all seen, as we said, the I'll do it one more time just for fun. The iPad preview. So that's Capture One running on an M1 chip on an iPad Pro. You're welcome. But we have also seen Andrew's shot, so Snowdonia, the rivers, and how pulling back that data, those highlights and what would be effectively clipped information, just pulling down the exposure and pulling down the HDR sliders together can pull all that detail back. Krisjan's Iceland shot, again, just be careful that by pulling in what you think is more contrast, you're not adding in color and unwanted stuff. This, to me, just feels a bit more real. And then Claudiu's, we spent a lot of time on this one, but I think it's important. There's a lot of things on Cityscapes, especially with lights. Just be careful that you're recovering stuff as best you can and then worry about the artistic stuff. So get all the data in. It's all about getting that detail in first and then play with how you want it to feel. Cool. So that's it for today. We obviously have, we can continue on the discussion about iPads if you want on the Facebook group. So you are all free to join that. We just have one simple rule in there, which is don't be an idiot. But other than that, fair game. And of course, you've all got access to the YouTube Pro Tips videos, which are sort of 20-minute tips on each of the different tools. The key ones, we're going to be adding some more of those soon as well, which is pretty good because we've spent some time on some new tools too. Don't forget that you can send in your own images, and we'll try and edit as many as we can over the coming weeks. So paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. Go there. Please include your name. If you don't include your name, we cannot include your image. It's that simple. But between now and next week, so we'll see you again next Thursday, same time. Stay safe, do what you're told, get out if you can, stay in if you have to, and we'll see you then. Cheers everyone, bye bye.